Good evening, everybody. Hello and welcome to this evening's climate change debate. My name is Charlotte and I am a project officer for North Wales Wildlife Trust's youth-led project, Stand for Nature Wales, a project all about empowering young people to lead the way in their communities with solutions to the climate and ecological crises. Now, you might be wondering, why is the Wildlife Trust focusing on climate change? Well, our planet has experienced natural fluctuations in climate for its whole existence. 4.5 billion years. The naturally occurring greenhouse gases found in our atmosphere create a blanket effect, making conditions on Earth warm enough for life to exist. There have been some pretty big changes in Earth's climate over the past 800,000 years or so, but nothing as big as what we are seeing happen now. Human activity is rapidly increasing the amount of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere, adding to the blanket effect and warming our planet at unprecedented rates. The effect this is having on life on Earth is huge. Plants and animals exist in ecological niches, specific conditions required for a species to survive. With our planet warming, more extreme weather events occurring, and human activity actively removing wildlife in forms of deforestation, for example, the natural world is in crisis. Climate change is intrinsically linked to wildlife, which is where we come in. The climate emergency and the ecological emergency must be tackled together. So let's crack on. This evening's event is our first in a series of online events which we are putting on throughout this year. Our climate change debate this evening has been put together by a brilliant group of young people who we have worked with from our previous youth project and are continuing their journey with us on Stand for Nature Wales. Their passion and commitment to tackling the climate and ecological emergencies is incredible. And when they asked if they could put on a series of debates about some of the hot topics around these issues, how could we possibly say no? So the young people have come up with this evening's debate topic, which is all about where the responsibility lies in tackling climate change. They will be debating issues around consumers, corporations, governments, and whose problem it is to solve the climate crisis. Big discussions coming up this evening for you. But we don't want you to feel overwhelmed by these big discussions, which is so easy to do. Our aim is to raise awareness of the climate and the ecological crises, which I'm sure you already know plenty about if you're tuning in this evening, especially considering how much attention these emergencies are getting in the media at the moment. Stand for Nature Wales project is all about getting more people involved in the big discussions and in taking action and working together to find solutions to tackle the climate and the ecological emergencies at a local level. And we would love for those of you watching live to be a part of the discussion this evening. If you are watching on Zoom, you can use the chat or Q&A function to post your questions and comments. And if you are tuned in on Facebook Live, feel free to add your questions and comments to the live feed there. We've got two of our brilliant young people managing those feeds for us this evening. And we'll have a Q&A session at the end of all of the debates with our panelists who will be debating this evening. And we have a special guest with us as well this evening, Bangor University's Dr. Alison Cameron. So we'll hear more from her later on. Now, more about the debates, I'd like to make everyone at home watching aware that this evening's panelists are arguing one side of a debate which does not necessarily reflect their personal views and are debating their given argument to help us see both sides of each debate. So, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our first panelists on screen for the first of three debates this evening. We've got Megan and we've got Emily. They have both been involved with us at North Wales Wildlife Trust for a few years now. They are key members of the Stand for Nature Wales Anglesey Youth Forum, Morn Gwyrdd. Megan and Emily, hello. Our first debate this evening, if you guys are ready to just crack on. I'm really excited to hear what you guys have got to say. This debate is about consumers. Now, we're all consumers. So as consumers, should we be responsible for our own carbon footprint? Megan, do you want to start us off?
Shall. So hi, I'm Megan, and I'm in support of this motion and think that the consumer should be with the ones responsible for making themselves aware of the impact of their consumerism with regards to carbon output, and should actively be reducing their carbon footprint when they buy goods. The consumer can have a huge impact on the markets. So if they take the initiative and make mindful and low carbon decisions, they can ultimately lead governments and companies to become more environmentally conscious. A great example of how consumerism has managed to sway decision making is by shifting to buying plant-based and vegan products. From 2014 to 2016, the number of vegans in the UK increased from 150,000 to 600,000. As such, a number of supermarkets cottoned onto this and have released own brand vegan products to capitalise on this change in behaviour.
Hello, I'm Emily, and I'm arguing against this motion. I think that retailers and producers have the most important role to play in tackling climate action. Retailers and producers directly control what decisions consumers are able to make, so positive change must originate from the source. Retailers should not be waiting for an opportunity for profit to drive their decisions, because ultimately the climate is in crisis, and that will eventually impact their economy and business too.
I don't think you can say that companies are going to make decisions based on their I don't think you can say that companies are not going to make decisions based on customers and profits. For example, the fast fashion industry purely exists solely for because of the demand of convenience from their customers. It is also an incredibly lucrative industry due to its very large profit margins.
I think that these large profit margins only benefit companies in the short term, and a throwaway culture created by the advertisement, production, and retail of fast fashion actually harms businesses in the long term, due to the inevitable consequences of climate change. For example, droughts will impact food production, forest fires may destroy crops and places of business, and the companies will only have to finance more and more emergency responses as the impacts of climate change becomes more prevalent. It's only good business sense to invest now instead of pay the price of climate action in 20 years' time. The initial large financial cost of climate mitigation will be cheaper in the long run than doing nothing now. Climate will directly impact retail production, so it's good business sense to consider the associated profit and financial sustainability of carbon and biodiversity at their heart of the long-term business plans, not just what the consumer wants.
I completely agree that businesses should make long-term plans that are centred around climate and biodiversity because it just makes sense. But this is something that's going to be very difficult to achieve, as there's far more return for businesses in the short term than in the long term, unless there's a complete shift in attitude across the board. I think consumers need to make up for these shortcomings by driving this shift through realising the impact that they have on the market. Not only that, but we as consumers can make the decision today to make better shopping decisions, which will force companies and producers to make more environmentally friendly and less carbon heavy choices.
Really interesting points to begin with, girls. What about the hidden carbon outputs that the consumer doesn't see sort of further up in the supply chains?
Well, frankly, retailers must be responsible for their entire supply chain's carbon footprint. For example, the synthetic fibers for fast fashion are made from oil, and vast acres of carbon sequestering habitat is lost to build factories and distribution centres. And the sheer amount of often non-renewable energy that goes into the mass production of clothes, phones, and food products is just not sustainable for carbon or wildlife. And don't even think about the humongous footprint of next day delivery. In fact, last week, The Guardian revealed a report that only 20 firms actually produce 55% of the world's plastic waste. But this is ultimately good news, as it provides us with a concise target of individual companies who are the problem, instead of convincing change in billions of individuals whose personal carbon footprints are minute in comparison to those humongous polluters.
I think it's incredibly easy and a little bit lazy to push all the blame onto these 20 firms, because the fact is that we demand these products from these companies, whether we know it or not. That's not to say that they are free from all responsibility, of course not. And stats like this are incredibly useful, as we can now target our consumer pressure to these 20 firms through boycotts and changes in purchasing habits, which will ultimately force them to make positive changes.
How can we change purchasing habits though? That's a big ask.
You can change it through many ways, but I think one of the really powerful tools that we have in our arsenal is to change purchasing habits is through trend setting by influencers and celebrities, which isn't kind of talked about a lot. Influencers and celebrities are able to broadcast trends to millions of followers, which is essential when it comes to promoting environmentally friendly products. And an example I'm going to use here is reusable water bottles. So celebrities like Matt Damon, Jonah Hill, Julia Roberts, all of which have been seen endorsing the use of reusable water bottles, may be succeeding where environmental activists fail in encouraging those who are indifferent to protecting the environment to make eco-friendly decisions. The influence of these celebrities will have contributed to the surge in the reusable water bottle market, which as of 2020 is worth $61.74 billion US, which is a lot. Those that actively want to combat climate change, like yourself, Emily, and me, are willing to change their lifestyle. However, passive environmentalism that is carried out by celebrities and their followers is essential when it comes to tackling climate change, since it's going to be difficult to convince everyone to make changes to their lifestyles.
I do agree that trend setting is one way of encouraging people to make changes that impact the environment positively. But ultimately, the way things are at the moment, retailers just aren't making a conscious effort to make truly green products accessible and affordable for the everyday consumer. In fact, trendy eco items can often be inflated in price by retailers due to high demand and them being so fashionable. However, some example of this is like a plastic toothbrush. And whilst it's great they're finally entering the market, they can be 2 to 3 times more expensive and need replacing just as often. Plastic-free alternatives to cling film, such as beeswax wraps, are also just not convenient or affordable for the everyday family. And these have come from own startups from the consumer. Therefore, innovation to fill these niches needs to come from manufacturers, multinational corporations, and the producers to fill this niche.
Beeswax wrappings, as you gave an example, are really quite expensive, yeah. But I think, like you mentioned, they are quite a niche product at the moment. And if it becomes more fashionable to use them and more convenient, as most trendy items do over time, the price will be lowered and they'll become much more widely available to people. Another example, which is a bit of a bigger scale, is electric vehicles. Recently, there's been a surge in demand for electric vehicles, and as such, availability has kind of followed this pattern. I think a lot of that is down to the promotion of these vehicles by individuals like Elon Musk, whatever you think of him, as well as changes by the government with their 2030 target. Although the supply of electric vehicles is not necessarily at the level that we need at the moment, they are moving in the right direction, which is really positive.
Whilst the consumer demand for electric vehicles is rising, the wide-scale infrastructure is just not in place for every car user to make the switch, even if the price per unit is the same as a fuel engine. And so multinational corporations will need to take the first leap and demand to provide the necessary nationwide infrastructure from governments and other private corporations, such as we saw with petrol fuel pumps increasing after the invention of the car. And surprisingly, Amazon is actually making one of these steps by beginning to use an electric green fleet of delivery vans, utilizing the scarce resources for an effective reason. In fact, providing consumers with a truly carbon neutral option for travel actually lies in the private companies who own public transport. We want to see more wide-scale electric buses, trains, and taxis at an affordable price, instead of forcing consumers to make pricey decisions now.
Those points are brilliant, but it doesn't take into consideration where we live in North Wales, where you have to have a car to get around, especially if you want to be in the field that we do. And I strongly believe that personal electric vehicles will become much more affordable and available to people in the future. To do this, though, there needs to be an initial investment from people who can afford them, but also by companies, as you mentioned, and those people need to kind of invest in the future now. which will overall lower the price for everybody else in the long run. I think one of the biggest issues with electric vehicles, which again is something that you touched on, is that the infrastructure isn't there yet, especially for personal vehicles. And that is something that consumers can target their pressure on when it comes to the government. There are two instances recently where this has been really quite successful. The first being the ban on plastic straws last year. And I think a lot of this was due to the outcry from the public after the impact of plastic waste on marine life was kind of surfaced in the media. And this kind of led to consumers opting for eco alternatives, like metal straws and paper straws, or not using them at all because you can drink a drink without a straw, surprisingly. Another great example is the ban on peat sales for gardeners in 2024, which is incredibly positive when it comes to climate change, as the remaining peat can continue to soak up atmospheric carbon. And again, I think this is an instance where consumers have become educated and opted out for compost without peat. As I mentioned, both of these are kind of examples where the consumer has been educated, and this has led to a change in behaviour. And this is something that I do believe to my core, is that education is something that needs to be encouraged and actively done. And a great example of this is through the Blue Planet 2 documentaries, where all this stuff about the impact of humans on marine life was highlighted. If we as consumers educate ourselves on where our food comes from, on where our produce comes from, and the value of its carbon footprint, we can start to put serious pressure on companies and governments to take notice and actually do something about it.
I really do agree that education must be at the forefront of any green revolution to reducing our carbon footprint globally. However, an educated consumer pressure only works when customers have credible alternative low carbon options on the shelves. However, companies are increasingly participating in an activity called greenwashing, packaging products with eco-friendly colours and phrases without upholding the promises behind them. This deceives well-intentioned, educated customers, taking advantage of their ethical considerations. Therefore, retailers should be honest and not greenwash in-demand eco products just because they see a profit. They aren't always truthful, so consumers can't make these educated decisions as easily as they should be able to.
Greenwashing is a huge issue, and I think a lot of us have seen it, particularly in recent years, as all this stuff about our impact on the environment has come out in the media. But again, I think the way we can combat it is for consumers to take responsibility and educate themselves on the products they buy and the companies that they buy from. This is particularly essential for environmental activists, as we can and want to actively educate ourselves, and we also have the passion and drive to do it where others might not. And we can then go forward and support and help our friends and family in making better decisions, which accumulatively will have a much better impact.
Really interesting points from you both there. I could listen to you guys going back and forth all evening, but we've got two more debates. So can I ask you to kind of wrap up and conclude with perhaps some solutions to these problems?
I think that realistically, retailers, producers and investors need to be held legally responsible for taking the most responsibility for mitigating climate action, to protect their future livelihoods and provide sustainable employment opportunities for the long term. They absolutely should make it easier for consumers to access greener options to encourage both consumers to make forward-thinking carbon neutral decisions. And in fact, governments should play a huge part in bringing this communication in the market.
For me, consumers need to take far more responsibility than they currently do, and need to make more effort to educate themselves and their friends and family on how to make positive purchasing decisions. But this effort can be supported by companies and governments, because they really don't make it easier for us, and we do need their help.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you, especially with kind of the bit about kind of it's up to us on the ground. If we're already engaged in it, we're doing our bits, spread the word, speak with your friends and family, and eventually they'll start to make changes. I've seen that myself with my friends and family. Yeah. Ladies, thank you so much for that debate. That was really interesting. Such a great way to kick off this evening. You can disappear off now, and we'll bring you back at the end because for those of you perhaps that missed the beginning of this, we're going to have a Q&A session at the end of all three debates this evening. So we're going to save up all of your questions and comments. So whether you're watching on Facebook Live or you're on our Zoom webinar, you can pop your questions, pop your comments in. They're being monitored by a couple of our young people who are working behind the scenes with us this evening. And we will gather all of those together and we'll see how many we can get through at the end of all three debates that we've got this evening. Okay, but yeah, thank you, Emily and Megan. That was a brilliant start. So let's move on to the second debate of this evening. I'd like to welcome Jacob and Lawrence on screen. So Jacob was a part of our previous youth project that we had before Stand for Nature Wales, and he's still involved with North Wales Wildlife Trust, as well as on the national Our Bright Future Youth Forum as well. Also from the Our Bright Future Youth Forum is Lawrence, who is actually not from North Wales Wildlife Trust. He is from Shropshire Wildlife Trust. And these two are coming on to our second debate this evening. So the two of you, are you ready?
Yeah.
Brilliant stuff.
Yeah.
Okay. Fab. So the second debate this evening is a very interesting one. Does everyone have equal responsibility for climate action, regardless of their wealth? Jacob, are you kicking us off?
Yeah. So I am taking the for stance in this argument. So I am agreeing that everyone does have an equal responsibility to address climate change, as everyone contributes to it in different ways and everyone is impacted by it in different ways. And the best way forward to solve this issue is for everyone to contribute to it in proportion to their own capability.
Okay. I'm Lawrence, and I'm arguing against this motion. Now, it's certainly true that we're all being rocked by the same storm, in a sense, in the face of climate change. But some people and countries, and these are often the wealthier, have contributed more to climate change in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and land use, and therefore should take greater responsibility for taking action on it.
I do agree that for the most part, wealthier countries can sort of have more power in like controlling the climate in that sort of sense. Like we do tend to make less climate conscious choices in terms of single-use plastics and buying foods that are considered luxury and may not be able to be grown in certain countries. And have to be shipped from quite far away. But I also believe that these issues can be solved like on an individual level. So each person can make the decision to educate themselves on what is good for the environment and what is bad for the environment. And once that education is made, it would not be ethical to choose the decision that is not good for the environment. And that's probably the major issue with the climate crisis, is that there's very little education about what's actually good and what's affordable that can be done to stop global warming and stop all this climate catastrophes from happening. And that's what needs to be focused on more so than the money side of things.
I entirely agree that there is a lack of understanding about the issues in the population of the UK and the population of the world generally. But although individual actions are laudable and should be taken, money plays a huge part in what is possible for people. So many parts of what would be a climate-friendly lifestyle are too expensive for the less wealthy. So as we've already seen, some climate-friendly items, such as, for example, vegan foods, are seen as luxury products, and so their prices could therefore be inflated, often by the wealthy in the shape of people who run retail organisations. Additionally, some solutions such as solar panels and electric cars are at least currently simply too expensive for the less wealthy, but wealthier people could easily afford to make these changes, and indeed, due to their strong commercial influence, often have a degree of control over the options that the less wealthy have available to them. Now, as well as having a greater degree of disposable income, the wealthier people tend to be more time rich, possibly allowing them to devote more time to activities that may help combat climate change, possibly in a voluntary role, such as ecosystem restoration, restoring forests, for example. So perhaps, again, all these factors give the wealthier among us a moral imperative to take action on these issues, because they do have the greater ability to do so.
I agree that there is an issue with like the current pricing of certain climate conscious choices such as vegan foods, electric vehicles, and like renewable energies. But I have to sort of divert it back to the sort of side of that. If there was more education on how to develop these technologies and how to cook certain more climate friendly foods like vegan foods from the raw materials, because a lot of vegan foods do have a lot of processing done into them in order for them to retain a lot of nutritional value. But there is also a lot of sort of good climate conscious foods which could be made for relatively cheap, and it could even be more cost effective for families to be able to provide with those sorts of recipes as opposed to meat-based and animal-based products instead. In terms of the wealthier having more responsibility to sort of change climate change and devote more time to it, we sort of need to put ourselves in those sorts of shoes and imagine what it would be like if we were told that we're not doing enough when we might not be contributing as much compared to other people. And this is where like some sort of climate fines could be applicable and could be beneficial to help solve this crisis, as it would directly impact the people who are causing these problems.
So, there's a lot of ideas there and a lot of very good ideas. Now, tackling them one by one, in terms of penalties, fines for carbon dioxide or otherwise greenhouse gas emissions. Now, the idea of an equal punishment for an equal crime, if you will, is a very attractive one in some ways, but it has problems. So if penalties were equal to all, the wealthy would simply pay fines without concern, essentially buying the ability to pollute. Paying to pollute is a sort of a recognized phenomenon, something that does happen. So a recent example of a problem along these lines concerns the clean air zone, which is due to be introduced in central Birmingham, in which a flat charge for polluting vehicle classes has been introduced. But it's been suggested that this limits the ability of the less wealthy to access the city centre. In other words, allowing the more wealthy to pay to pollute. Perhaps a better model would be along the lines of the speeding fines system that has been introduced, or that is in place in Germany and Finland, among other countries, in which fines are proportional to income. Thus, the wealthy cannot simply pay to put others in danger. And this perhaps is an avenue that could be explored. Now, in terms of the position of wealthy people, now it's very, very, it's understandable that it would be maybe frustrating to be told that you need to bear a greater responsibility for a problem that affects everyone. But to many ways, the wealthy have been the cause of the problems to a much greater extent than the less wealthy, through activities such as frequently flying in aircraft. And as we've already noted, they've also have much more freedom to make the necessary lifestyle changes. So arguably, given these points, can they ethically take no or less action on an issue that will adversely affect so many people, not to mention wildlife? I would argue that they should therefore be prepared to take greater responsibility for finding the solutions. And this arguably is true on all scales. The people of wealthy countries, who themselves do tend to be wealthier than the global average, often create demands for goods produced in carbon-intensive ways in developing countries, most notably in South and Southeast Asia. Now, these supply chains are not counted in the greenhouse gas emissions of the countries in which the demand is found, the countries of the purchasers. So arguably, developed countries are contributing more to climate change and exporting the consequences of their actions to developing countries that are more at risk from their from the effects of climate change.
There were a lot of really interesting and really valid points, which I agree with a lot, discussed there. And I'd like to take a moment to focus on the idea of the proportional fines idea. And it's important that when discussing the idea of proportional fines, that we remember that in order to solve the issue, we need to work together. And by forcing larger fines onto one group of people instead of another, it could discourage them from wanting to dedicate further time and resources into solving the problem. It could also create a bit of a disconnect between the two groups and cause less communication, which could lead to less progress being made to prevent further damage to the environment. I do also believe that it is not ethical to expect for one person or one group of people to pay for the problems that are happening to everyone, as it would encourage those who are not paying to start causing damage, as they don't have any responsibility or sort of, and they don't really have much to lose if they do that. But if it were to happen like that, then it would, yeah. And while a lot of the wealthier do live much more luxurious lifestyles with higher carbon emissions, it's important to note that a lot of them would be quite shocked to hear that they would have to pay large amounts of money, like you said. But they'd also be confused as to why they need to pay more money than someone who has done the same thing as them, but makes less money than them. And it could, again, create that bit of a disconnect between the two groups.
Yeah, I agree that disconnect, lack of empathy between the groups, the more wealthier and the less wealthy on all scales, is a huge issue. But the fact is, and maybe this is something, of course, that the wealthier, the citizens of wealthy countries, for example, should be aware of, is that developed countries will suffer far less than developing countries in the consequences of climate change. For example, for a variety of reasons, increased flooding in Bangladesh would have far greater consequences than comparable increased flooding, which we are seeing in the UK, but both are predicted by the science. Furthermore, many developing countries are heavily in debt to developed countries, meaning that, and much of their infrastructure is often owned by governments and businesses based in wealthier countries, such as China's control of much of the transport and energy infrastructure in sub-Saharan Africa. This means that often the governments of developing countries don't have the freedom to take action on climate change in the way that developed countries do. They have neither the financial resources nor the control of their material resources. Now, there is another very valid point. There's another point here. Developed countries have increased the quality of life of their citizens through passing through a high carbon industrial phase of their history over the last 3 centuries or so. And this has been a major driver of climate change. Arguably, one of the main challenges of this century is for developed countries to support developing countries in increasing their citizens' quality of life without undermining the wonderful and beautiful, let's not forget, natural systems on which we all depend.
I 100% agree that the wealthier countries do have a lot of the they have a lot of the blame almost for the climate crisis and sort of the cause towards it through certain phases such as industrial revolution and the high carbon emitting phases like that. But it is also important to ask the question as to whether or not it would be even possible for a nation to advance into an industrial revolution without a high carbon emitting phase. And if so, how much investment would that take and who would pay for it? Would it be that nation or would it be a wealthier nation in the form of foreign investment or something similar? And if so, would those foreign investors be adequately compensated for the development of the nation, as opposed to investing the resources into their own country? It's also and to carry on with your sort of argument of the flooding in Bangladesh compared to the flooding in the UK. Every country suffers adverse effects due to climate change. Regardless of the country's wealth, these can be catastrophic if the country is not prepared for them. And while there is an issue with less developed countries not having adequate infrastructure to cope properly with these catastrophes, it would be almost unfair to ask the developed countries to prioritize investing into those countries instead of their own if they suffer similar natural disasters. And it's also important to note that a lot of the less developed countries and a lot of the less developed countries do have certain natural they do have sort of natural stores of fossil fuels which could in a way create jobs, and it's whether or not it would be ethical for them to either to try and develop their economy if it's going to further destroy the planet, or whether that would be something which the wealthier nations would have to lower their carbon usage to a point where not only are they not causing further damage to it, but there's to the planet, but there's enough sort of leeway to allow for these developing nations to use a lot of these high carbon emitting things without causing further damage. Yeah, you carry on.
So you raised some very important questions that urgently need answers. Now, I feel that what can we conclude from this? Now, I would suggest that we can conclude that it's important for everyone to take action in response to this emergency. Individuals and countries should be prepared to act proportionally to their means, those with more resources to use them for good, and for there to be appropriate financial support to enable action by all.
I 100% agree with this, and I also agree that one solution to this would be that we find nature-based solutions which are able to combat this and that are affordable. One example of this could be wildflowers that are native to a specific area and can be planted for relatively cheap. It's also able to be scaled to fit different groups or government needs in that area. So that would be one possible solution. And it's important that we find more solutions similar.
Wonderful. Thank you, both of you. Jacob and Lawrence, that was brilliant. You've raised some really, really important points, perhaps some contentious points. I really like the idea that Jacob's made about climate action not just being about money. Can we not perhaps be rich in nature, rich in wildlife instead of money? I prefer that way of thinking. Jacob and Lawrence, thank you so much. You can disappear for now and come back for the Q&A at the end of the next debate. So for those of you watching at home, don't forget you can submit your questions to us via Zoom or via the Facebook live feed. There's a Q&A coming up at the end of the next debate. So we would love to hear your comments and questions for our panelists and special guest. So up next then, we've got our third and final debate. I'd like to welcome Kieran and Ellen on screen. Thank you both for joining us this evening. So Ellen is another of our key young people who has been involved with North Wales Wildlife Trust since our previous youth project. So thank you for joining us, Ellen. And Kieran joins us especially for this event. He's a conservation biology student at Kent University. So it's great to have you two along. Our final debate is about governments. So a little aside here, a reminder that North Wales Wildlife Trust is apolitical, just in case either of these two throw any curveballs our way. I'm sure they won't. So let's get cracking. Ellen and Kieran, in order to tackle the climate crisis, should governments be focusing on getting large corporations to reduce their carbon footprint, or should they be concentrating on individual action? Kieran, are you starting us off?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Kieran, and I'm speaking in support of the motion that government should focus on large corporations rather than individuals. And the reason for this is that a 2017 report found that 100 corporations are responsible for 71% of carbon emissions globally, and this figure is unlikely to have changed substantially since then. In terms of getting the most bang for their buck, which is vital if we are to decarbonise the economy at the rapid rate that we now need to in order to meet things like the Paris climate goals, government should focus on corporations, as these are the heavy emitters.
Ellen, you're on mute. We're off to a flying start. Try again.
Hi, I'm Ellen, and I'm arguing that government should focus on individuals. I would agree that corporations are largely responsible for carbon emissions. However, I think that it's much harder for governments to drive change within business organisations than it is to inspire change within a population. Corporations are focused on ensuring profits, which makes them more reluctant to change. Meanwhile, the world population continues to grow by approximately 74 million people globally each year. All of these individuals will have an impact on carbon emissions, be that contributing or their carbon footprint. To actually make a difference, it is the individual actions of the general public that matters, and they need the support and focus of governments.
While it is true that governments may struggle to get corporations to change, particularly large multinational corporations, if this is the reason for not encouraging these changes, what kind of message does that send? Individuals forced to pick up the burden of these companies refusing to change. What we need are climate justice and carbon accountability. Those who have emitted the most heavily in the past need to be made to pay for the transition to a lower carbon future. And also, corporation change will drive individual change too. An example of this would be the recent ban on the sale of peat compost, which means that individuals will stop using peat in their gardens because peat compost will no longer be available from garden centres or compost companies. This is good news, as peat bogs are a vital carbon sink, storing more carbon per area than many other better known habitats such as rainforests, and they are being destroyed by demand for compost. And what this shows is that regulating businesses will drive individual change.
In reference to your first point, what kind of message does it send? I would agree that it's not a good one. But at the end of the day, corporations will follow their profits over anything else. Therefore, by focusing on individuals, those most interested in tackling climate change, then you will begin to see a change in consumerism, which will encourage corporations to alter their actions to please the consumer and maintain profits. To provide an example of people driving change, over 11,000 people signed a petition to have peat compost banned by 2023, and that's something that you referred to. It was individuals that drew the government's attention and awareness, leading to the ban of peat compost.
While it is true that corporations will follow their profits before anything else, that doesn't mean that they won't change. Recent studies have shown that investors in the fossil fuel industry have concerns about the climate crisis, and changing patterns of investment show this too. Corporations will have to change eventually in order to please these investors, and government moves such as taxing corporations proportionately for their emissions will only incentivize this change and speed it up.
But that does not negate the point that individuals are the ones that want the change. Only last year, a YouGov poll showed that 2/3 of the British public wanted the UK government to lead the world in tackling climate change. The poll shows that people in the UK want the government to help expand renewable energy and increase the energy efficiency of people's homes. The little things can go a long way to help reduce carbon emissions. Each individual's carbon footprint adds up and creates a much bigger effect, which is why it is vital for people to make changes in their lifestyles, even if it is just small. Having the government supporting individuals in making these small changes has a much bigger, more effective impact. For example, renewable energy is shown to produce more energy and fewer emissions, so the government increasing energy efficiency in people's homes would be one change that would make a big difference.
While I agree that housing as a whole is a way we can drive a lot of this change, these improvements can be made by the corporations that are building new homes too. Earlier this year, the UK government announced that new homes would have to have carbon emissions 75 to 80% lower than present builds by 2025. And focusing on legislating companies rather than incentivizing individuals would allow a greater amount of housing to be impacted at once. And focusing on individual actions may simply encourage more greenwash. If the onus is put on the consumer to make environmentally conscious decisions, what the corporations will most likely do is the minimum amount in order to seem more sustainable and therefore still encourage customers in, whilst protecting their bottom line and still carrying out destructive, more economically viable actions. For example, one example of this is fossil fuel companies putting out carbon footprint calculators so that their individual customers can calculate their individual carbon footprint, while these same companies are emitting never before seen quantities of CO2 themselves and spilling millions of tons of oil into the Gulf of Mexico, for example.
Yeah, I would agree that greenwashing is a huge issue, particularly in the last few years as many environmental issues have surfaced. I believe that even if governments were to focus on corporations, though, that this would still be an issue. As was mentioned in one of the earlier debates, I think that one of the most important things that we could do to tackle greenwashing is for consumers to be educated on the products and companies that they are shopping from. Governments should aid in this process. They should be providing resources and creating and supporting anti-greenwashing campaigns, like two sides, to make it easier for consumers to change their habits and spot greenwashing. This would make change both accessible and more reliable. If this action is taken by governments, it would encourage companies to make genuine changes and become greener to seek government endorsement.
Really interesting points from both of you so far. Moving away from that and towards something else, transport is a huge carbon issue in the UK. What should the government be doing about that?
In many countries, including the UK, they have set the goal of making green transport the mainstream by 2030. But I think that there are many reasons why people might not want to use greener methods of transport, like public transport or cycling. And that's because they aren't always accessible, whether that be due to a lack of affordability, limited access in rural areas, or something else entirely. Governments could make things easier for individuals through a funding scheme. This would allow far more people to access public transport, at least financially. Governments could also endorse or fund campaigns such as the Cycle to Work scheme or others where individuals are encouraged to travel by public transport or by bike or by any other means of transportation. However, I think that there are flaws to these schemes, such as the Cycle to Work scheme. It's not accessible to those who are unemployed, which excludes a large proportion of the population. The government therefore needs to go further in making these schemes accessible for everyone who needs them. This would make people the focal point of change.
While it is true that present public transport infrastructure is inadequate, widely inaccessible, and therefore unable to limit car use further than it already does, I would argue that this needs to be changed at a company level. Governments could incentivize travel companies by offering subsidies so that, for example, so that bus companies are able to travel on less profitable, more rural bus routes. And these subsidies could also encourage companies to lower fees, which would make public transport, such as buses and trains, more accessible for many and enable them to limit carbon-intensive car use further.
Interesting. Thank you, you two. So I think to bring this debate to a close, what are your final thoughts and what action do you think the government should take?
So I think it's fair to say that both individuals and corporations have roles to play in the transition to a low carbon future. For our future's sake and the generations that come after us, the most important thing now is that this transition does happen. And I would say that as young people, we value governments that take this crisis, this unprecedented challenge we find ourselves facing, seriously.
Yeah, I would agree completely. Any action taken to help the environment is positive, whether that be individual or corporate action. Regardless of which side of the debate that people are on, or if they're on any at all, I think that it's important to make it clear to those that represent us that these are the issues that we care about. People should contact their local MP and assembly member, research candidates tackling the climate crisis and make their voices heard. The biggest action that I think the government specifically could take is simply listening to those that are well informed and making sure that as many people as possible are well informed. They should ultimately just commit themselves to fighting the climate crisis.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ellen and Kieran. Really interesting sides of both arguments, and I think a very valid sort of meet in the middle conclusion. So that brings us to the end of our debates for this event. And we're going to move on now to a Q&A with any of our panelists that wish to offer up answers to the questions. There are a lot coming through on my screen, so we'll have to see how many we can go through. Before we begin with the Q&A, I'd like to introduce our special guest for this evening. We've got Dr. Alison Cameron with us. Alison's PhD was focused on assessing the relative effects of habitat loss versus climate change upon biodiversity. She was a lecturer in climate change adaptation and mitigation at Queen's University and is now in Bangor as a senior lecturer in zoology and teaches the Life in a Changing Climate module. So, hello, Alison. Thank you for being here.
Hi, thank you for the introduction.
What did you make of the debates this evening that the young people have put on for us?
There were some really nice points in there, and I think I maybe to give a personal perspective on this. I've been teaching about climate change. I've been studying it for 20 years. And I have to say, I started off quite skeptical. I genuinely thought habitat loss was a bigger threat to biodiversity, and I didn't understand how much climate change would be. And I've seen a sea change of, from skepticism and misunderstanding through to people developing a deeper understanding, and it's really lovely to see people embracing this and wanting to debate it and put it out there. So I sort of almost feel like the job's done for me as an educator, because school children are marching and students are doing these debates, and this is such a different place to where we were 10, 20 years ago. It fills me with optimism. I've got lots of other reasons to be optimistic, but just this event makes me feel really positive.
Yeah, it's kind of really heartwarming from my perspective to be able to enable and empower our young people to to say yes, and let's put these debates on, let's have these discussions and put it out there, because the more we can talk about it, the more positive stuff's going to happen.
You need to recognize a problem before you can solve a problem, and talking about a problem leads to solutions. So this is such a big step.
Exactly. Right, we've got loads of questions, and we've got plenty of time actually. So let's see how many we can get through. So I'll pose the first question, and then if any of the young people want to chip in, you can turn your cameras on, and we can kind of we can come to all of you. So the first question here is about electric cars. So electric cars require a lot of materials like lithium that mining for is really bad environmentally, and some materials are very hard to find. How good are electric cars overall when you consider the full process to make them? So who wants to? Alison, do you want to tackle that first? Are there any keen panelists that want to jump in? Just turn your camera on if you've got anything that you want to say. Otherwise, I'll hand over to Alison. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, I'm happy to have a go at this. So I've seen some interesting statistics on how much of the world's fleet of vehicles we could afford to electrify. And I've had some interesting debates with my own father over this one, because he invested in an electric vehicle which he charges from his own solar panels. So it's a good system. There's a lot of embodied energy in a car. And so, any car is environmentally expensive to make, but electric vehicles are really resource intensive, and there's a lot of resources in them which are finite, that we just don't have enough of them to make a lot of these vehicles. So there is an argument that if you want to play clever, what would be best to do is try to focus electrification into the vehicles that are on the road 24/7, that are almost in perpetual motion. So things like buses and taxis. So instead of, my dad's car sitting there and being driven a couple of times a week to the shops, if all his tech was in a taxi being driven 24/7, it would be saving more emissions. So I think, given that they are a finite resource, we need to think quite carefully about how we spend it. But that doesn't mean that people shouldn't be out buying electric cars, especially when, we haven't got to the finite part. And I think one of the good things is a lot of the parts in those cars are recyclable. So, they can be repurposed in the longer run. But we are going to have to look for other solutions in addition to electric. So hydrogen is something that's coming along as well, which is pretty optimistic.
Interesting answer, thank you. Jacob, do you want to come back on that?
Yes, you mentioned that the certain parts can be recycled. I think, sort of like, to carry that on, I think that in order for like larger scale electrification of vehicles to take place, we do need to do a lot more research into them to develop that technology further, so that we can create them using significantly less environmentally damaging resources, as that would help to further the amount of cars which can have this technology, and could help to resolve it much more tidier than we could do right now with the current technology.
Lawrence?
I think that it's certainly a very, very important point that we ought to be concentrating on electrifying vehicles, all forms of transport, that, well, for the public transport and minimizing private transport, though as we heard in the first debate, it won't be possible everywhere. But I think it's also easy to forget, because it's a little bit out of sight and out of mind, that we also transport vast quantities of goods around the world, vast quantities of freight. And equally, we should also be looking to transport that in bulk wherever we can, in order to minimize the resources that we use on that and gain economies of scale.
Yeah, interesting point. I think something that's just popped into my mind as well is using vehicles less, traveling less. Do we need to be moving around so much? And you know, if we've got access to a bicycle and if we've got safe ways of getting around on bicycles, for example, is that perhaps a better option to look at? Emily, you've popped up on the screen. Hello.
Hello. Yeah, I just wanted to add that with Lawrence's point of freight is that we should really be sourcing our food locally, because the air miles in some of our food, where we can't power certain ships electronically with electric batteries, like in reality we should just be eating food which is within season and sourced locally and supporting local economies, because that's another part of consumer pressure where we are at the hand of the change, which is really, really promising.
Yeah, thank you. All right, let's move on to the next question. I think we covered that first one quite well. So the next question on my screen here is, I think, linking to perhaps something that Megan or Emily alluded to in the first debate. What are your suggestions for if celebrities and influencers accidentally or are even paid to promote companies that have a tendency to greenwash or may not actually be lessening their carbon emissions? So back to the sort of the greenwashing and the celebrity influencers trying to change the world. Megan.
We did touch on this in the first debate, and I do kind of wholeheartedly stand by what I said, in that celebrities and influence are a tool, and a really important tool, for targeting the people that aren't accessible to us as the Wildlife Trust or environmental activists, because we only influence and relate to a portion of the population. We don't reach everybody. But it is something you've got to consider, in that celebrities and influencers do have motives. They will be paid by certain companies to promote certain products. Money is a huge influence there. But I think the only thing that you can do there is, take what celebrities say with a pinch of salt, which was something I think that a lot of people do. Not everybody, but a lot of people do it. And making sure that you're researching the companies that they advertise, making sure that you're educating yourselves on what products they're advertising, on who they're endorsing, because not everything's going to be good. And greenwashing is a huge issue, as we established. Companies will go the smallest amount seems sustainable in a lot of instances. So it's making yourself aware of the products that are out there. But as I said, if we can, maybe if environmental activists can influence celebrities, that might be one way of tackling it, in actually getting them to promote the actual low carbon products, the actual sustainable products. Then you're giving the right information to their followers.
Interesting thoughts. Yeah, we live in a funny world now, with celebrities and influencers having playing such a big part in our lives. And I saw a really interesting sort of infographic the other day that showed, back in perhaps, I don't know, say like 50 years ago or 80 years ago, something like that, the percentage of sort of known people, well-known people, famous people, how many of them were scientists, how many of them were sports people, and so on and so forth. And in the past, the main famous, well-known people were scientists, were people who have done really incredible, amazing things. And now we've got this infographic was incredible, because it basically was like all of the famous people are just celebrities and influencers and stuff, and then there's like scientists like tiny in the corner and things like that. So we have to be using it, that is the way that the world is, and if we can use the celebrities, the influencers, the people that can reach out to the masses, then that could be a solution. Thank you, Megan, for that answer. Right, let's move on to the next question. So, how do we prevent climate solutions, for example, wind farms and hydroelectric plants, from interfering with vulnerable ecosystems like important marine areas and sensitive river species? A really good question. Yeah, because we're not just trying to solve the climate crisis, but also the ecological crisis, and it has to work together. So, Emily.
Hiya, yeah. So often in times where we are looking for like an immediate revenue profit for electric power, we look to sort of exploit the local ecosystems because we don't have a financial ticket on how much they cost to protect. So you'll find wind farms on marine protected areas just because the upwelling of nutrients is amazing for the ecosystem, as well as the wind, which comes with the climate. And it's a problem that needs to sort of be protected within legislation, because we are at the crux and the tipping point, as Greta Thunberg says, in that you can't have a healthy ecosystem without a healthy climate. You can't have a healthy population without a healthy ecosystem. And I hate to hark on about how a pandemic is a consequence of shifting ranges of species and coming into contact with humans, but that is a consequence of climate change, and will becoming more and more consequent with other actions. And really, we just need nature-based solutions for carbon sequestration, which don't infringe on habitats which are already on the brink. And in this way, we can restore peat bogs, we can build protected areas with seagrass, and we can reforest on places where flooding is very, very common. And there are an amazing batch of nature-based solutions that the Wildlife Trust is trying to sort of be a part of, as well as provide other governments to be a part of. So yeah, they're out there, and we can do it.
Thank you. Lawrence.
I think that it's absolutely true that it's very important that nature-based solutions should be taken up and pursued. But I mean, it should also be remembered, of course, that unless we are going to radically change the way our way of life in order to use far, far less electricity, which we may need to do in any event, we will need some means of electricity generation. And certainly it is problematic that often, for example, as we said, the best sites for wind farms turn out to be also very ecologically important sites. And this, every case must be considered very carefully. I think it's worth bringing in here the attitude that the RSPB have often taken to this, which is to say that they oppose wind farms only when they absolutely have to, because they recognise that the biggest threat to the world's ecosystems is climate change, and therefore renewable energy is important to pursue in as many cases as it's practicable.
Thank you, Lawrence. Yeah, valid points. Kieran.
Yeah, I'd just like to add and build upon what Lawrence was saying there, in that we will definitely need renewable electricity infrastructure somewhere. And as you say, oftentimes it ends up on these important wildlife sites. But I think one of the main drivers of this is because these sites are often remote and sparsely inhabited, and you often see sites being refused for other reasons by more populated areas. For example, they spoil the view or cause too much noise or cause too much disruption to people. So I think what we need to do is really very carefully consider what are valid, genuine reasons for refusing wind farms, such as long-term ecological damage, rather than simply ruining the sea view for a couple of cottages, in order to allow us to create sufficient renewable energy infrastructure for us to power the future.
Yes. Megan, before we move on to the next one, what have you got to say?
Just a small point. Considering actually making urban environments a powerhouse for renewable energy. Houses should be made to, they should be able to generate their own energy by putting solar panels on top of houses, and all this type of stuff. And you could even, from that, people could generate their own income from the power they produce from their houses. We tried looking at getting solar panels on our house. And one of the ideas you could have is you generate your power and then you sell a portion of it back to the national grid that you don't actually use. That actually isn't in place yet for that to work, which seems really bizarre, but it's not actually profitable for an individual to generate their own power and then sell it back to the national grid, which is really strange. So things like that, making it easier for individuals to create their own energy so they're not taking it from the national grid, which is burnt by fossil fuels, is going to be really important so that we don't have to infringe on delicate habitats.
Yeah. I guess coming back to sort of what was previously discussed in the debates as to kind of like those that can afford it, making those steps, and the government's enabling that to happen. Yeah. Alison.
Yeah, I think I could maybe make a connection with one of the topics about, we've talked a lot about the panelists have talked a lot about individuals and corporations. And I'm always quite interested, for example, if you go local here and there's a debate about the solar panel proposals on Anglesey. We've got a lot of roof space on commercial buildings, which is quite amenable to, with maybe some modification, large amounts of solar panels being put on them. And I never understand why there isn't more of an incentivization or even a more compulsory element to making that space available before solar farms are put out onto agricultural lands or other lands. Now, that's not talking about wind, that's talking about solar. But I think when you look at the amount of good space we've got, we're not making particularly good use of it yet.
So I think we could keep going on this all evening. It's our remit as the Wildlife Trust, thinking about how to work best with nature, not against it. We'll move on because I've got a long list of questions here, and we'll see what else we can get through. So the next one we've got is, wow, does anyone have any good ways to convince people who aren't bothered to make changes, or small changes that are easier and people won't object to?
Wildflowers. They look amazing. There's a huge variety of them, and they can be planted almost anywhere in like a pot on a windowsill, or if you've got the garden space, planting them in the garden can actually help to grow your other plants through attracting pollinators. So wildflowers are definitely an amazing way to go with encouraging other people, as far as that's my opinion though.
Thank you, Jacob. Alison.
I think a lot of people who perhaps don't think they're environmentalists are actually quite concerned about air quality and their own personal health. And I think that's often a really constructive route into discussion about climate change, because the emissions that go along with vehicles often go along with serious chronic illnesses as well. So, you can sometimes enter a discussion from a different point. But another one too is to look for win-wins. So a really big win-win is the fixability of household appliances and cell phones and things that people don't like. They might like a nice new shiny fridge or a nice new shiny phone, but actually they quite would like their phone to be fixed or their fridge to be fixed. And I think there's a lot of people who are quite supportive of legislation that will demand components to be more interchangeable and fixable. So, that's another route into convincing people. I think sometimes if you just go head on into climate change, you can get roadblocks with some people, but you can get there through finding side doors to the discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. Who wants to go next? Megan, you're next on my screen. So do you want to go?
Shall I think the biggest one for me, particularly recently, has been looking for things secondhand online. I've been looking for a wetsuit for ages, and Facebook Marketplace and eBay have been my places to go. And particularly touching on like fast fashion and stuff, I think buying secondhand clothes from places like that is going to be essential for kind of solving this throwaway culture that we have. Just because it's secondhand does not mean that it's bad. People tend to sell things because they're too small when they're brand new. So I think that will be one of the easier ways to convince people to genuinely reduce their waste is buy secondhand, whether it be from a charity shop or online.
Yeah, and another win-win because it's always cheaper than buying it new. So yeah, Lawrence.
I suppose that one possibility, the first one that springs to my mind, is to demonstrate the effects, or educate or communicate the effects of climate change, be that on wildlife or be that on humans. For example, as I mentioned, the effects of flooding in Bangladesh, the effects of prolonged droughts in sub-Saharan Africa, the wildfires in California and in large parts of Australia over the last couple of years. The challenge then might be making the link between your journey, your car journey across town, or your flight to the Mediterranean or whatever, with those effects.
All right, so Lawrence going quite the opposite way to the finding the side doors is like the hard-hitting facts. Hey, that will work with some people, absolutely. Emily.
Mine's also another side door, and it's finding those hidden causes of climate change which people don't even know about, and they actually become quite surprised and intrigued, and they go down a rabbit hole of Wikipedia wondering how is that actually created to climate. And one of those things is actually emails. Emails have a carbon footprint. It's not as big as receiving 1,000 letters through your inbox, but think of it was 1,000 letters, because all those emails are powered by usually like coal-powered servers somewhere not in your own country. But the cloud isn't an invisible thing. The cloud isn't carbon neutral. So clean out your inbox, stop hoarding 14,000 emails like I had, and make sure that you've got like climate conscious technology, as Alison said. And I won't hark on too much about Bitcoin, but avoid currencies now. It's very current. Avoid currencies with a massive climate footprint. Even though it might make you lots of money, that's also, there's other paperless ways of cashing in.
Yep, go on. Alison, yeah.
One thing I've found some people maybe are a bit more interested in talking about sometimes as well is pensions, because if you think about the concept of future-proofing your life, but also future-proofing for climate change, some of the green investment funds are doing really, really, really well. Certainly for university lecturers, the staff pension fund, the green option, is doing as well, if not better, than the other option. And so sometimes when people find it hard to make a decision that will change their daily behavior, they might make a decision like that, which is for the future and doesn't actually change what they're doing on a daily basis. But it goes again back really well to the discussion about companies versus individuals. An individual can make that decision, and then that money is being available to green companies to develop their business plans, and you're feeding through to company action, and you're putting borrowing power into that community of companies. So I think often when people look at the statistics for those investments, they're quite charmed by them. And yet they're not being asked to sacrifice their drive to work or anything on that given day.
Very interesting. Thank you for that. That was I've learned something there as well. I've not considered that before. And I guess as one thing I want to add here as well, which I think is really important, linking the ecological crisis and the climate crisis together, and getting people to kind of want to make changes is helping people to connect with nature. If people are more connected with nature, if they go out, take them out for a nice walk and get them to, I don't know, hug a tree or whatever, smell a flower or watch a bird for a bit, you're helping to connect those people with nature further. If they then realise the value of nature intrinsically to them, they're more likely to want to look after it. And if you can then make that link with them, that the climate crisis is having an impact on nature, and if you want to carry on hugging trees and watching birds and smelling flowers, then you're going to have to make some changes. We'll move on from this one, because I think as a project, we are really keen to help spur people on with loads more ideas. So we're going to touch upon this, I think, in a little bit more detail in our next online event, which is coming up at the end of this month. And we're actually going out to do some face-to-face community events over the summer as well, which are being organised at the minute. Those dates will be coming out soon. So that's something that we're really keen as a project, and as our forum are really keen to kind of spread the word with solutions. So do stay tuned on that. I think we've probably got time for one more question, which means I've got a little bit of pressure to try and choose a good one, because there's loads left in front of me. I think, we'll just go for the next one, because that's okay. This person has said, I was wondering if, as young people, having seen the way us older people have been living our lives, would you still be happy to live a less consumer-led life, not just replacing things with sustainable items, but actually buying a lot less in the first place? Emily.
Yeah, so I think our generation is sort of at the forefront of something called like a zero waste lifestyle. And it's coming into all of our shops on the high street now as well. So it's having reduced packaging and reduced demand for such extravagant luxuries. And you don't need an overconsumption of products to feel happy. And even if you do need something necessary, there is such an overwhelming sort of supply that you can find things secondhand, like almost everything these days. And we're lucky to have had 50 years of manufacturing behind us so that we are in this position to have secondhand things. But even primary produced goods such as beans and soups, you can find them just as zero waste alternatives. So you could just bring your own packaging, and so it's consumer less because you don't have the packaging, but it's also less convenient, so it encourages us to slow down. And in reality, we've seen how that can be really good for our mental health as well. And we just all, you know, having a better connection to where our food is coming from. You go to pick your own farms, buy locally, slow down a bit. Like post-war people say that that's how it used to be and that's how it should be, and we're all better for it.
Great answer, thank you, Emily. We'll come to Kieran, then we'll come to Lawrence. So Kieran.
Yeah, and I think there's a very good point to be made here, bringing it back to the corporations as well, because you've got things now that you didn't have in the past, like mobile phones. Even I remember in my younger days when mobile phones used to last you like 5, 6, 7, 8 years, whereas now all of a sudden there's a new one coming out every year, and a lot of these devices, which take an awful lot of energy and have a massive carbon footprint to produce, all of a sudden have built-in redundancies in them and stuff. And I feel like that is something that definitely needs to change, and that is something that there is a lot of demand to change. And as Alison was saying before about having components that can be changed out and switched around more efficiently so things can be repaired rather than simply buying new. And so yes, certainly in things like electronics and that, there is a massive need and massive demand from, I suspect, across all generations to reduce this throwaway culture.
Yeah, thank you, Kieran. Finally, Lawrence, and then after this, I'm going to pose one final question to Alison, and then we will wrap it up. So, Lawrence.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm just following on from Kieran. I can recall at the time thinking of mobile phones being sort of energy intensive when a mobile phone charge would last you a week. But Kieran touched on the culture that we live in, a sort of throwaway culture that we live in. And we do live in a sort of a consumer culture which sort of developed over the course of the 20th century, in which we are encouraged to take part in the latest fad, acquire things that we don't strictly need. So perhaps it does require not just a change to individuals, but a sort of a wider cultural shift back towards towards a state in which people are not being expected to, or on some level expected to, buy the latest thing and accumulate possessions that are not really necessary, like we just talked, or replace things unnecessarily.
Yeah, absolutely. The most sustainable choice is not buying it at all in the first place, isn't it? Yeah, thank you. Right. Just quickly before we wrap up, there's one final question that Alison has requested. She wants to answer. So this question is, do you think our expectations, or the public's expectations, that science will help us deal with climate change are too high? And this attitude perhaps encourages lack of personal action.
Yeah, I was really fascinated by this because as a climate change scientist, I've seen attitudes change a lot from, well, basically we're bonkers and the climate isn't changing and what are you talking about, and you're scaremongering and, you know, there's no need for us to do anything. And I think what I've perceived amongst a lot of people more recently is a sort of a prisoner's mentality of, well, there is nothing we can do about it. We now know it's happening. We're going to accept it's happening, but it's too big. And so I think I've perceived it, and it may be because different people speak to me differently. I'm a scientist, but I've perceived it more as an inaction because of a feeling of being overwhelmed by the size of the problem. I've not really encountered many people thinking scientists can solve it until more recently. And I think because of COVID and the success of vaccinations, people are getting a bit more excited about what science can do. But I think it's a really good point. You know, why are people not taking action? And there might be a lot of substance in that. I'd be really interested to see more surveys and more. I think by probing people's attitudes, you also get to the problems. So I was just fascinated by that as a comment. I can't give such a strict answer to it, but I just thought it gave a really interesting insight into an audience member's thought process, maybe.
Yeah, really interesting. One thing that I've been doing with the forum in preparation for helping to communicate climate change and solutions to the general public in North Wales has been to consider what are all the different types of people's kind of perceptions of climate change, and where they're sort of, if they have any responsibility to do anything about it or not. And yeah, I think it'll be really interesting to go out on Anglesey this summer with the young people and talk to people and get some of that kind of that insight into the wide variety of thinking as to what do we do about climate change? Is it my problem or not? So yeah, I think more on that to come from us as we go and speak to people and see what happens. Yeah. Thank you. Right, we are very, very nearly at 7:30, so that will be our final question for today. There's loads more there, but we've got to wrap up. So I'd like to say, firstly, a huge thank you, Alison, for coming along, taking the time to attend this event this evening. It's been really great to have you here as like a special guest, a scientist here to help answer some of these questions.
It's a privilege. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd obviously, of course, like to thank and say well done to all of the young people who have put in loads of time and effort to put this debate together. There's been lots of researching, lots of messaging, lots of meetings in the background going on. So all of the young people involved in this evening's debate, a big thank you and a big well done to you all. And to everyone watching at home, thank you for tuning in, sending so many great questions and comments in. It's really important, like we've said, to be engaging people in these discussions so that everyone feels empowered to be part of positive solutions to the climate and ecological emergencies. It's so easy to feel overwhelmed and negative when we focus on the issues, but I think, as this evening has proved, when we focus on the solutions and talk about the future in this sense, it's empowering. There's hope. We've got more events coming up, as I've mentioned, so keep an eye out on our events page for that. There's also loads of other events out there that our amazing Wildlife Trust staff are putting on. So join in with those and just keep your eyes peeled. The other Stand for Nature Wales online events and face-to-face events will be coming up online very, very soon. So just keep your eyes peeled. You can also sign up on the website to the Wildlife Trust e-news. That's a great way to stay informed with loads of different stuff that's going on across the Trust, not just Stanford Nature Wales project, but across the whole of North Wales. And if you use social media, of course, you can find North Wales Wildlife Trust on all the social media channels. It's a great way to get inspired by nature and find out more about what we're up to. Engage with 30 Days Wild. That started yesterday. That's our big June thing that's going on. So do something wild every day throughout June. And that's it. Thank you so much for joining us. Go and enjoy the rest of your evenings. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much.